The hospital bracelet was still on my wrist when he left. I remember that detail so clearly because I was looking at it when he set the car keys on the kitchen counter, my parents' kitchen counter, and said he needed space. 3 days. Our son was 3 days old. I hadn't slept more than 40 minutes at a stretch. My milk hadn't come in properly, and I was crying about that, specifically when he walked in with his jacket already on. He didn't say goodbye to the baby. I didn't cry after he left. I think I was too tired, and honestly too stunned. My mom came in from the hallway. She'd heard everything, I could tell, and she just sat beside me on the edge of the bed they'd set up in the guest room and held my hand. She didn't say anything, neither did I. My son made small sounds in the bassinet beside us, these tiny animal sounds, and I just stared at the ceiling of the room I'd grown up in and thought, okay. That was the last thought I had that felt clean and clear for a very long time. My husband and I had been together for 4 years before we got married. We met at a work event. I was doing communications for a mid-sized nonprofit in Ottawa. He was consulting for one of their corporate sponsors. He was confident in the way that reads as secure when you're 26, and desperate to believe that confidence means something. He had a good laugh. He called his mother on her birthday. I thought I'd done my research. We got married in September out near Prince Edward County. It was a beautiful day. I have the pictures. When I got pregnant, he said all the right things. He came to the appointments. He assembled the crib badly. I redid half of it when he wasn't looking, but the effort was there. I thought we were fine. I thought we were more than fine. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't understand until much later, was that my husband had a very specific idea of who I was supposed to be. And pregnancy had started to complicate that picture. I wasn't performing the version of me he'd married. I was tired and slow and scared and real, it turned out, was not something he was equipped to handle. He left notes in the early days, texts, not even notes. Things like just need to figure some stuff out, and this is a lot for both of us. I stopped responding after the third one. I had a newborn. I didn't have the bandwidth for decoding. My parents lived in a semi-detached in the glebe, and my dad had converted the guest room into something almost comfortable. A proper bed, blackout curtains, a mini fridge so I didn't have to navigate the stairs at 3 a.m. My dad is a quiet man. He'd just leave things outside the door, a cup of tea, a plate of toast. Once, inexplicably, a crossword puzzle book, which made me laugh for the first time in 2 weeks. My son, I'll call him by the nickname we settled on early, Pip, because he was so small, so impossibly small, was a difficult newborn. Colicky, they said. He screamed from 7 to 10 every evening without fail, and I would walk him in circles around that little room, singing the same 4 songs I could remember the words to, swaying until my arms went numb. My mom took the 5 a.m. shift, so I could sleep in 3-hour blocks. I don't know how I would have survived without that. I went back to work at 11 weeks. I know what people say about that. But my mat leave top-up from the nonprofit was modest, and my husband, who I was not yet divorced from, who was technically still my husband, had gone quiet on the financial support front in a way that my lawyer later described, diplomatically, as non-compliant. I needed the income. My mom took Pip on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and we found a home daycare for the other days, a woman named Teresa on a quiet street in the glebe, who had a dog named Biscuit that Pip became obsessed with before he could even properly walk. It was small, my life then, deliberately small. I kept it that way on purpose. I should explain how I met my father-in-law, because that's the part of this story that nobody believes when I tell it. My husband's family was complicated. His father had built a commercial real estate business over 30 years, starting with a single strip mall in Barrie, and ending up with a portfolio that spanned 3 provinces. He was not a warm man, from what I'd heard. My husband didn't talk about him much, and what he did say wasn't flattering. There'd been a rupture between them years before I came into the picture. Something about my husband refusing to join the business, about money and expectations, and the specific cruelty that sometimes lives inside father-son relationships. They hadn't spoken properly in years. I had met my father-in-law exactly twice before my husband left. Once at the wedding, briefly, and once at a Christmas dinner that was so tense I developed a tension headache before the soup course. He'd looked at me across the table with these assessing eyes, not unkind exactly, just evaluating, like he was running a calculation. 6 weeks after my husband left, I got a phone call. I didn't recognize the number. I almost didn't answer. Pip was napping, and I was eating crackers over the sink, which was my lunch situation at that point. and I picked up mostly out of reflex. "This is Theodore Marsh," the voice said. "My father-in-law. I heard what my son did. I'd like to meet if you're willing." I stood very still for a moment. Pip made a small sound on the monitor. I looked out my parents' kitchen window at the backyard, at my dad's tomato plants that he'd been nursing since March. "All right," I said. We met at a restaurant on Elgin Street. His suggestion, a quiet place, not flashy. He was already seated when I arrived. He stood when I came in, which surprised me. He looked older than I remembered, or maybe I was just looking more carefully. He didn't open with pleasantries, he said. "My son is a coward. I want you to know that I know that." I sat down, I didn't say anything. "I also want you to know," he continued, "that the child is my grandson, and I'm not interested in pretending otherwise." I had prepared, on the drive over, to be guarded, to be polite but non-committal, to not give anything away, to protect myself and Pip from whatever this was. I had spent 11 weeks being very careful, but something about the directness of it, the complete absence of performance, made me set down my defenses, just slightly. "He's 7 weeks old," I said. "He has your son's nose, unfortunately." Theodore Marsh looked at me for a moment, and then he laughed. It was a short laugh, rusty, like he didn't use it much, but it was real. That was the beginning. I want to be clear about what happened next, because I'm aware of how it sounds. I'm aware that people hear daughter-in-law befriends wealthy father-in-law and immediately start filling in blanks. Let me fill them in myself. Theodore did not swoop in and save me. I didn't need saving, and he wasn't built for swooping. What happened was slower and stranger than that. We had lunch that first time for almost 2 hours. He asked about my work, the actual work, not the polite version. He had opinions about nonprofit communications that were wrong, but interestingly wrong, and I told him so, and he seemed genuinely startled that I'd pushed back, and then genuinely pleased. He asked about Pip. I showed him pictures. He looked at them for a long time. He asked, carefully, whether I was managing financially. I told him I had a lawyer handling the support issue, which was true, and that I was working and that my parents were helping, which was also true. I did not ask him for anything. It didn't occur to me to ask him for anything. I was not whatever anyone wants to believe running a play. He called 2 weeks later, asked if he could visit. He brought a stuffed moose that was almost as big as Pip, which made my mother laugh despite herself. He sat in the armchair in my parents' living room and held my son for 20 minutes and didn't say much. Just looked at him. I watched him from the doorway and felt something I didn't have a word for. Over the next year and a half, Theodore became a presence in our lives in a way that I hadn't anticipated and hadn't engineered. He came to Ottawa every 6 weeks or so. He called on Sundays. When Pip started daycare full-time and I moved back into my own apartment, a 2-bedroom in Centertown, nothing fancy, good bones. Theodore sent a grocery delivery the first week without asking, just Whole Foods and things for Pip, and a very good bottle of Shiraz with a note that said for the first night the boxes are unpacked. I got my support payments sorted out through my lawyer. That was mine, my own fight. Theodore never inserted himself into the legal process, never offered to throw money at it. He understood, somehow, that I needed to win that myself. What he did do was talk to me. That sounds small, it wasn't. He'd built his business from almost nothing, made real decisions with real consequences, and he was one of those people who becomes more honest as they get older, who stops bothering with the performance. He'd tell me about deals that had gone wrong, about times he'd trusted the wrong people, about his relationship with my husband in a way that was fair, even when it was hard. He wasn't asking me to hate his son. He was just telling me the truth. I'd tell him about work, about a campaign we were running, about organizational politics, about a major donor who was threatening to pull funding and what I was doing about it. He'd listen, ask sharp questions, push back when he thought I was wrong. He told me once that I had a better grasp of stakeholder dynamics than anyone he'd worked with in 30 years of commercial real estate. I said that was a low bar, and he said, "No, actually, it's not." I started to see myself differently in those conversations. Not as someone who'd been left, as someone with a point of view. 2 years in, Theodore was diagnosed with a heart condition. Not immediately life-threatening, but serious. The kind of thing that requires medication and monitoring, and a real reckoning with what you've built and who gets to carry it forward. He told me about it on a Sunday call. His voice was even because that was how he was. He said he'd been thinking about the business, about the structure, about some decisions he'd put off making. I need someone I trust to look at some things with me, he said. Not legally. I have lawyers for that. I mean someone to think with. I'm not a commercial real estate person, I said. I know, that's partly why I'm asking. I started going through documents on evenings after Pip was asleep. Board structures, partnership agreements, the trust arrangements he'd set up over the years. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm a clear thinker and I can read. And what I kept finding was that the structure had gaps in it, places where a motivated bad actor could cause real damage. I wrote up my observations in plain language. He read them. He disagreed with 2 points and agreed with the rest, and the 2 he disagreed on, he turned out to be right about. He brought in his actual lawyers to address the structural issues, but he kept calling me on Sundays. His board became aware, I think, that there was someone he was consulting informally. I don't know exactly what he said about me. I know that at some point I was introduced to 2 of his most senior people at a dinner in Toronto, and they were not surprised to meet me, which told me he'd mentioned me more than once. I was building something, not deliberately, not from a plan. I was just showing up, every time, as someone worth talking to. I heard from my husband for the first time in over 2 years on a Tuesday afternoon. Pip was at daycare. I was on my lunch break, eating a sandwich at my desk, because that's the kind of person I'd become. Efficient, I'd call it. When my phone buzzed with a number I'd blocked and then, apparently, forgot to reblock after I got a new phone. Hey, I've been doing a lot of thinking, I'd really like to talk. I read it twice, put my phone face down, finished my sandwich, picked it up again. I'm not sure what there is to talk about, I wrote back, because I'm not someone who ignores messages, even messages I'd rather not receive. He said he'd changed. He said he'd been in therapy. He said he wanted to be in Pip's life. Pip, whom he had not once asked about in 2 years, not once sent a birthday card to, not once acknowledged in any practical way. He said he'd been going through something when he left, that he understood now how unfair it had been, that he wanted to make it right. I thought about what making it right would look like. I tried to construct the image. It wouldn't come together. If you want a relationship with your son, I wrote back, contact my lawyer. That's the appropriate channel. He didn't respond to that. He tried a different angle. He wanted to meet in person, just to talk, just the 2 of us, said he thought we could sort things out between ourselves, like adults, without involving lawyers. This is a thing people say when they don't want a record of the conversation. I said I preferred to keep things through proper channels and left it there. What I didn't know, what I found out later from Theodore, who told me directly because that was how he operated, was that my husband had reached out to his father around the same time. That he'd gotten wind, somehow, of Theodore's health situation and the questions around the business succession. That he'd called and left messages positioning himself as, in his words, ready to step up. Theodore called me on the following Sunday as usual. He told me about the calls. He said, I want you to know what's happening. You're entitled to that information. I asked him what he'd said in response. I haven't responded, he said. I'm not sure I will. There was a pause. I was in my kitchen. Pip was in the living room destroying a puzzle. I could hear the pieces hitting the floor. You don't owe him anything, I said finally. No, Theodore agreed, I don't. My husband showed up in Ottawa on a Saturday in October. I don't know if he'd planned to announce himself. Maybe he thought spontaneity was disarming. He buzzed my apartment and said he was downstairs, that he just wanted to see Pip. Just 5 minutes. Pip was 3.5 by then. He had learned to pump his legs on a swing. He had opinions about which color of cup his juice went in. He called Biscuit the daycare dog by name in his sleep sometimes. He had never met his father. I stood at my intercom for a moment. I thought about the buzzing feeling in my chest. Not fear. Exactly, something more like alertness. I thought about what I was going to say. This isn't how this works, I said into the intercom. You know how to reach my lawyer. I heard him start to say something. I pressed the button that ended the intercom connection. I stood in my hallway for a few seconds. Then I went into the living room and sat on the floor with Pip, and we finished the puzzle together, the one with the Canadian animals on it, the beaver and the loon and the black bear, and Pip held up the last piece, the moose, the one that always got lost, and said, Mama, found it, with complete satisfaction. I thought, yes, we did. Theodore had a procedure in November, minor, they said, which is a word doctors use to make families feel better. He came through fine. I drove to Toronto when he was discharged, brought Pip, and we sat in the main room of his house, an older house in Rosedale, more lived in than I'd expected, bookshelves everywhere, while Pip investigated every corner with the seriousness of a property inspector. Theodore watched him from his chair by the window. He looked tired but steady. "He's good," he said, not a question. "He's great," I said. Theodore nodded slowly. "You did that." I almost said we both did, meaning Pip had done most of it himself, because children do, they just grow. But I understood what Theodore meant, so I just said, "I know." He told me that week that he'd spoken to his lawyers about formalizing some things, that he'd made decisions about the trust, about Pip's future, that he was comfortable with. He wasn't asking my input, just informing me. He told me like I was someone who should know, and I received it that way. He also told me he'd sent his son a letter. He didn't tell me what it said. I didn't ask. I found out the rough contents of that letter through my own lawyer. 2 months later, when my husband filed an objection to certain aspects of his father's estate planning. The objection went nowhere, legally, because Theodore had structured everything very deliberately, with people who knew what they were doing, over a long period of time. But the attempt told me everything about where my husband's head had been for the past several months. He wasn't coming back for me. He wasn't coming back for Pip. He was coming back because he'd done the math, and the math had not gone the way he'd expected. I'd done my own math quietly over 3 years, not about money, about what I was building, a reputation at work that was mine alone, a son who was thriving, a relationship with a man who respected me in the specific, precise way I hadn't known I needed to be respected. Not romantically, not in a way that complicates the story, just as a person whose thinking was worth engaging with. That was not nothing. That was, I realized, actually everything. I was promoted at the nonprofit that January, director of communications. It meant more responsibility and somewhat better pay, and an office with a door, which sounds minor but mattered more than I expected. I called my mom when I found out. I called Theodore on Sunday and told him, and he said, "Good, they should have done it sooner," which was exactly the right thing to say. Pip started junior kindergarten in September. He walked in on his first day with his little backpack, covered in dinosaurs, his choice, defended fiercely against all alternatives, and didn't look back. I stood at the door of the classroom, watching him introduce himself to a boy by the window, this small person I'd made, and felt something move through my chest that I still don't have the right word for. My ex-husband, formerly my ex by then, had arranged one supervised visit through the proper channels. He showed up. He sat in a room with Pip for an hour with a social worker present. Pip was polite in the way he is with strangers. He didn't ask about him afterward. There was one more visit scheduled. My ex canceled it. I don't know why. My lawyer documented it. Life went on. I think about that morning sometimes. The hospital bracelet on my wrist, the car keys on the counter, the way he walked out without looking at the bassinet. I used to think the story began there, with that leaving. I don't think that anymore. I think the leaving was just the moment I stopped organizing my life around someone else's comfort. It was clarifying, in the end, the way very cold water is clarifying. I'm not going to tell you I'm grateful it happened. I'm not performing gratitude I don't feel. What I will say is that I know who I am now in a way I didn't know at 29. I know what I can carry. I know whose voice in my head is worth listening to. I know that a person can be left in a guest bedroom with a newborn and a hospital bracelet and no clear plan, and still, find their footing. Pip asked me last week, out of nowhere, the way kids do. We were making pancakes. He was in charge of blueberries, which meant half were in the batter and half were in his mouth. He asked if I had a best friend. I said I had a few. I told him about my friend from university, who lives in Vancouver and who I call too rarely. I told him about Theodore, who he calls by his first name now, who sends him a book every birthday with a note inside. I told him about Grandma and Grandpa downstairs. Not downstairs anymore, but always reachable. And me, he said, very serious, a blueberry in each hand. You're a different category, I said. You're essential. He seemed to find that acceptable. He deposited both blueberries into the bowl and moved on. I stood at the stove and thought, this is the life. This is it, right here, on a Saturday morning with the snow coming down outside and my kids supervising the pancakes and the apartment warm and mine. I didn't plan this life. I built it from the pieces of what was left after someone walked out a door, and it is, I know this now without any doubt, exactly enough. I've thought a lot about what it actually takes to come back from something like that. Not bounce back. That phrase has always annoyed me, like pain is a trampoline. Just come back, to yourself, to a life that feels like yours again. What I keep returning to is this. The morning he left, I had nothing that looked like a plan. I had a 3-day-old baby, and a hospital bracelet, and a guest room in my parents' house, and a very deep tiredness that went beyond sleep. What I did have, and I didn't know I had it then, I only see it clearly now, was a baseline sense of what was right, not in a grand declarative way, just, this is not okay and I will not pretend that it is. That quiet refusal to perform gratitude I didn't feel, to accept behavior I knew was wrong. I think that was the first thing that saved me. Not a dramatic act of courage, just not lying to myself. Theodore used to say that the most important quality in anyone he worked with wasn't intelligence or ambition. It was honesty about what they didn't know. I think that applies to life as much as business. The moments I made the worst decisions, not in this story, in general, in the years before, were the moments I refused to look clearly at what was in front of me. Once I stopped doing that, once I started just seeing things as they were, instead of as I wanted them to be, everything got harder in the short term and better in the long term. That's been consistently true. The other thing, and this is harder to talk about because it sounds like something off a motivational poster, which I genuinely cannot stand, is that I kept going when there was no particular reason to believe it was worth it. I went back to work at 11 weeks not because I felt ready, but because I needed to. I made my apartment mine, not because it felt like home, but because I needed it to. I showed up to every Sunday call with Theodore, not because I knew it was building something, but because it was the right thing to do. That's a different kind of strength than the heroic kind. It's not dramatic. It's just, do the next thing, and then the one after that. My husband came back when he thought there was something to come back for. That tells you everything about what he understood and what he didn't. He saw resources, positioning, opportunity. He didn't see, because he wasn't capable of seeing, and I don't say that with contempt, I say it as a plain fact, that what existed between Theodore and me, and between Pip and me, and between me and the life I'd built, was not something you can walk back into after 3 years of absence. You don't get to harvest what you didn't plant. I'm not interested in the version of this story where I'm the wronged heroine and he's the villain. That's too clean, and real life isn't clean. What I know is that I made choices, consistently over 3 years, that were grounded in what I actually believed was right. For Pip, for myself, for the people who showed up for us. And those choices compounded, quietly, without announcement, into something I'm genuinely proud of. Pip found the moose piece. Every time somehow he finds it. That feels like the right note to end on.